Thank you very much for being with us. We've been discussing this evening Vladimir Zelensky's speech at Davos, where he was critical of his European allies for not acting quickly enough in their own defence, but of course in defence of Ukraine. The situation now approaching its 4th anniversary. That's the full-scale invasion by Vladimir Putin's Russia, launched in February 2022. The situation about what happens next, of course, is still up in the air, with much discussion as to how Ukraine's resistance will be financed. Well, let's get more on how Ukrainians themselves on the ground are resisting and what threats they are coming across in their everyday lives under Russian occupation. Our guest is Jade McGlynn, head of the Ukraine and Russia programme at the Centre for Statecraft and National Security at King's College in London. Dr. McGlynn, thank you very much for being with us. Here in France, the word resistance is full of meaning in the sense of World War II. We'll get on to discussing that after this report by Monty Francis. Thank you.
These Ukrainians are picking up Russian passports. Now living under the occupation of Moscow, they were forced to do so or be classified as foreigners. The requirement came into effect this past September in the occupied regions of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. But there are signs of resistance. This spray-painted Ukrainian letter, which does not exist in the Russian alphabet, has become a symbol of defiance. In her report, Thresholds of Survival, Jade McGlynn, a research fellow at King's College London, says thousands of Ukrainians are resisting inside the occupied regions, both peacefully and with violence. Between December of 2024 and October of 2025, she documented a total of 248 incidents, including car bombings, sabotage on infrastructure, and at least 34 assassination attempts on Russian officials. With much of social media blocked, those in the resistance depend on secret Telegram chats. But the dangers of resisting are dire. Surveillance is widespread across the occupied territories, and the Kremlin has introduced an app called Max that fuses banking, messaging, and public services, requiring users to provide their biometric data. The Kremlin's objective, McGlynn says, goes beyond simple surveillance. She says the goal is to transform the population and erase Ukrainian identity. The acts of resistance across the occupied territories happen in the shadows. According to McGlynn's sources, only about 20% become known by the public.
Francis, there we saw Dr. McGlynn in his report. Let's bring her in now live to talk more about her findings. Dr. McGlynn, thanks for being with us. As I was saying earlier, resistance as a word has full meaning in France after World War II. I'm wondering what the sense of it is in Ukraine. How are people resisting?
Thank you. No, of course, it has, I'm sure, an incredibly emotional and symbolic connotation for French people. In Ukraine, I think that, unfortunately, the resistance is really not covered as much as it should be, and also in the West. In terms of the forms the resistance takes, it's often perhaps not as heroic as we remember, let's say, the World War II French resistance, but probably is much closer to how the World War II French resistance actors experienced it themselves. It's arduous, it's incredibly lonely. You're under, particularly with new technological innovations, under pretty much constant forms of surveillance that you always need to try to avoid. And the risks are incredibly high. I mean, there are 15,250 Ukrainian civilians who have just been abducted. The vast majority of them disappeared, many into black sites. There's a little more than disused garages or basements. And this can be for as little as a Facebook or a Telegram post that was written, several years previously. So the stakes are very high. However, the brutality of the occupation, particularly in the post-2022 areas, and also, the extreme economic and infrastructural collapse that many parts of the occupied territories are experiencing, naturally does fuel resistance.
And in terms of resistance, I think you've hinted at this already. If you can't meet in a clandestine manner anywhere because of surveillance, because of the way technology is used these days, it must be incredibly difficult to unite and have any kind of coherent movement.
It really is difficult, and of course the occupation is focused on destroying social bonds between people. I mean, this is quite a standard feature, in the Stalinist period too, the attempt to make people not trust one another. What we've seen among the networks that have survived since 2022 has been a shift. So if in general in NATO and Western doctrine there's a focus on a cell-based approach, which has a very clear command structure, everyone in the cell knows each other, well, under Russian filtration measures and surveillance, these cells were destroyed very, very quickly because it was easy enough to identify who might be in the cell, patriotic or civil society figures. And of course, once you'd identified one member of the cell, due to interrogation methods, you've pretty much, unfortunately and sadly, identified the other members. Now how it functions is according to a puzzle model most of the time, where agents do not know one another. So again, a very lonely existence, but unfortunately it does have to be that way so that you don't have what's called a sort of cascading compromise, where you find one member of the network and then the rest of the network is compromised because torture and other brutal interrogation methods will be used to extract information.
And that brutality, Dr. McGlynn, is something that clearly in your research you discovered the extent of that, and it doesn't discriminate. That they will be brutal to men, women, children.
Yes. There have been a number of reasonably for the occupied territories, well-documented cases of children, teenagers, being identified rather incredibly as the leaders of these, incredibly violent resistance movements, which is just, it's completely not possible, completely implausible. And then they die in mysterious circumstances, but later on, normally after about 9 months or so of really arduous work by, Ukrainians and I must say also actually Russians who are trying to find out, as easily as in incredible difficulty what is happening there, it will turn out that these teenagers were in fact, they died under torture or certainly in detention. So there have been a number of such cases, or of pregnant women being forced to give birth in what we would describe as black sites, so some of the disused garages that I discussed earlier. The conditions are very brutal. I mean, last year there was sort of a journalistic collective that wrote about the death of Victoria Roshina, a Ukrainian journalist who went into occupation to document, what was happening to civilians, and was then herself abducted. Her very mutilated and malnourished corpse was eventually returned around sort of almost, it was around 18 months after she first disappeared. And again, that's quite normal. People just disappear, and it's pretty impossible to know what's happened to them, sometimes for as many as 2 or even 3 years.
It's absolutely horrific what you've said. In your report, the phrase, the distinction between violent and non-violent resistance has largely collapsed. Does that mean that basically anything that any kind of resistance, it could be as simple as looking at a photograph, looking at a website, looking at social media, or even something bigger, it results in the same violent response from the Russians?
It means that it results in the same violent response. So at the end of November 2025, Russia published its new nationalities policy. And in that, it has a number of incredibly specific metrics about its intentions to Russify the occupied territories. But it also makes it very clear that any expression of Ukrainian or pro-Ukrainian identity or sympathy in the occupied territories should be treated as extremism, and indeed is treated as extremism or as terrorism. Therefore, to send a picture of yourself, for example, saying, this Crimea is Ukraine, which, may be the legally recognized status of Crimea, to Russia, that is separatism, terrorism, treason, and, will carry with it the risk of a very long prison sentence or, much worse, violence.
Dr. McGlynn, I need to stop you there. I'm really sorry. I hate to. No, what you're telling us is fascinating, but sadly time is against us. Jade McGlynn, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your findings in the research that you've published about resistance within Ukraine. Thank you for being with us on France 24. We really appreciate it. We take now a short